In the marble foyer of a Beacon Hill mansion, a young woman was about to face her family's ultimatum. What started as a dinner invitation took a shocking turn when she came face to face with her parents' rejection of her husband. Isabella Campbell wasn't your typical society daughter. For years, she had navigated Boston's elite expectations, known for choosing authenticity over status. When her parents demanded she abandon Marcus Thompson, she had no idea she was walking into 3 years of exile. Isabella chose love that would lead to devastating consequences, until her family discovered the nobody they scorned was actually General Thompson, a decorated war hero whose influence could save them all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of their modest apartment, casting gentle shadows across the worn but well-maintained furniture. Isabella Campbell Thompson stirred in Marcus's arms, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing against her back. 3 years of marriage, and she still found comfort in these quiet moments before the world demanded their attention. "Happy anniversary," Marcus murmured into her hair, his voice rough with sleep. Isabella turned in his embrace, studying the face she'd grown to love more with each passing day. At 32, Marcus carried himself with a quiet strength that had first attracted her, though she'd learned to recognize the careful way he held certain memories at bay. 3 years of you putting up with me," she said, tracing a finger along his jawline. "You deserve a medal." Something flickered in his eyes, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. Just a quiet dinner would be nice. Nothing fancy. "The Italian place down the street?" she suggested, knowing he preferred establishments where they could sit in corner booths, where he could keep his back to the wall and watch the room. She'd stopped asking about these habits after the first year, recognizing them as pieces of a past he wasn't ready to share. Marcus nodded, then glanced at the clock. "You better get moving if you want to beat morning traffic to the center." Isabella worked at Harbor Community Outreach, a nonprofit that coordinated services for veterans and low-income families. The pay was modest, but it gave her a sense of purpose that her business degree from Stanford had never provided, not that her parents had understood her choice. Nothing about her life now would meet their approval, if they were speaking to her at all. The memory hit her like it always did, sudden and sharp. 3 years ago, standing in the marble foyer of her family's Beacon Hill mansion, her mother's voice cutting through the air with surgical precision. "A nobody, Isabella. A man who works odd jobs and has no family name, no connections, no future. You're throwing away everything we've built for what? Love?" Patricia Campbell had spoken the word like it tasted bitter. Love doesn't pay for private schools or country club memberships. It doesn't open doors or maintain reputations. Her father had stood silent behind his wife, his face carefully neutral in the way that meant he was choosing not to see. Richard Campbell had built his import business on reading people, on knowing when to speak and when to stay quiet. That day, he'd chosen silence. "If you marry this man," her mother had continued, "you are no longer our daughter. You've made your choice and we've made ours." Isabella had married Marcus 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at City Hall, with only Elena Martinez as witness. They'd honeymooned for a weekend at a bed and breakfast in Vermont, spending more on 2 nights than they usually budgeted for a month. It had been perfect. "Hey," Marcus's voice pulled her back to the present. He was sitting up now, concern creasing his features. "Where'd you go?" "Nowhere important," she lied, forcing a smile. "Just thinking about our big celebration tonight. Hope you're ready for unlimited breadsticks and cheap wine." He studied her face with the same intensity she'd noticed the first night they met, as if he were reading a tactical situation. Another habit she'd learned not to question. "We could do something else if you want." Elena mentioned that new place. "Marcus." Isabella placed her hand on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "I'm happy. I'm happy with you, with our life, with breadsticks and cheap wine. I don't need anything else." The truth was, she mostly meant it. Their small apartment above Mrs. Chen's flower shop was warm and filled with laughter. Marcus's work with various veteran organizations kept him busy and fulfilled, even if he never talked about the specifics. They had enough money for groceries and rent, occasional nights out, and the kind of quiet contentment her parents' world had never provided. But sometimes, in moments like these, she felt the weight of what she'd lost. Not the money or the status. She'd never cared much about those. It was the family itself. Her brother David, who'd been 15 when she left and was now a stranger. Her father's rare but genuine laugh. Even her mother's fierce protectiveness, however misguided. Marcus seemed to read her thoughts. You could call them, you know. It's been 3 years. They made their position clear. Isabella slipped out of bed, reaching for her robe. Some bridges don't get rebuilt. She headed for the kitchen, needing the familiar ritual of morning coffee to push back the melancholy. Through the thin walls, she could hear Mrs. Chen starting her day downstairs, the soft sounds of someone who'd learned to live quietly after losing her husband. Another refugee from a family that no longer existed, though Mrs. Chen's reasons were far more final than Isabella's. Marcus followed her to the kitchen, wearing the jeans and plain t-shirt that comprised most of his wardrobe. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of years of discipline, though he'd always been vague about his military service. Just a desk job, he'd say when she asked. Nothing interesting. But desk jobs didn't teach a man to move like he was constantly aware of exits, or to wake instantly at unusual sounds, or to know exactly how to help when Vietnam veterans at the community center had flashbacks. Coffee? She offered, already reaching for his favorite mug, a plain white ceramic cup he'd brought with him when they moved in together. Thanks. He accepted the mug, their fingers brushing in a moment of simple intimacy. What's your schedule like today? Meeting with Elena this morning about the new housing program, then the veteran support group this afternoon. You're helping with that, right? If they need me. Marcus never pushed himself forward in those meetings, but somehow he always ended up where he was needed most. Last week, it had been sitting quietly with Tom Reeves while the older man worked through a panic attack. The week before, he'd somehow known exactly what paperwork Jerry Morrison needed to file for his disability benefits. They always need you, Isabella said, meaning it. You're good with them. Something shifted in Marcus's expression, a shadow of pain quickly suppressed. They deserve someone who understands. She wanted to ask what he understood, what experiences had given him such insight into trauma and loss, but she'd learned to respect the walls he'd built around certain parts of his past. Everyone had damage. Everyone had stories they weren't ready to tell. She loved him enough to wait. Her phone rang as she was getting dressed for work, Elena's name flashing on the screen. Hey, what's up? Just checking in, anniversary girl. How does it feel to survive 3 years with Mr. Mysterious? Elena Martinez had been Isabella's roommate at Stanford and her closest friend ever since. She'd been the only one who hadn't tried to talk Isabella out of marrying Marcus, perhaps because her work as a social worker had taught her to recognize genuine kindness when she saw it. It feels good, Isabella said, meaning it. We're celebrating tonight at Romano's. Fancy. You two really know how to live it up. Elena's tone was gently teasing. How are you doing, though? Really? I'm fine, Elena. That's not what I asked. Elena had a social worker's ability to hear what wasn't being said. Today's your anniversary, which means you're thinking about your family. Wondering what might have been different. Isabella sank onto the edge of the bed, phone pressed to her ear. Sometimes I wonder if David even remembers I exist. Honey, you were his big sister. Of course he remembers you. He was 15 when I left. He's 18 now, probably in college, probably exactly the kind of son they wanted. Maybe he's better off without me complicating things. Isabella, I have to go. Meeting you in an hour, right? Elena sighed. Right. But we're talking about this. We really don't need to. Yeah, we do. Because 3 years later, you're still carrying this around like a stone in your chest. And because Marcus notices it too, even if he's too polite to say anything. Isabella ended the call without responding, but Elena's words stayed with her as she finished getting ready. Marcus was in the living room when she emerged, reading something on his laptop with the focused attention he brought to everything. She'd learned not to look too closely at his screen. Not because she didn't trust him, but because sometimes she glimpsed things that looked official, governmental, the kind of correspondence that suggested his desk job might have been more significant than he let on. "I'll see you this afternoon," she said, leaning down to kiss him goodbye. "Drive safe." He caught her hand as she straightened. "Isabella, whatever happens today, remember that we built something good here. Something real." The words were oddly specific, as if he sensed some approaching storm. But then, Marcus often seemed to sense things others missed. Another mystery in a marriage full of them. Isabella drove to her meeting with Elena, Marcus's words echoing in her mind. They had built something good, something real. A life based on love and mutual respect rather than social expectations or financial security. It should have been enough. But as she pulled into the parking lot of Elena's office, she couldn't shake the feeling that the peaceful world they'd created was more fragile than she'd wanted to admit. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice that sounded uncomfortably like her mother whispered that love, however genuine, might not be enough to protect them from whatever was coming. The feeling would prove more prophetic than she could have imagined. In just a few hours, a phone call would shatter the careful distance she'd maintained from her past, forcing her to confront the question that had haunted her for 3 years. What price was she willing to pay for the love she'd chosen? Marcus's hand tightened on the rope as he finished securing the boat. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the veteran support group meeting they'd just finished, and Isabella's quiet contentment from their anniversary morning felt like a lifetime ago. Something had shifted in her demeanor during the session, a tension he recognized from his years of reading people in high-stakes situations. "You handled Tom's episode well today," Isabella said as they walked toward their car, her voice carrying that careful neutrality she used when something was bothering her. "He just needed someone to listen." Marcus opened the passenger door for her, a habit that had taken months to establish. Isabella had initially protested such gestures as unnecessary, but he'd quietly persisted. Some courtesies were worth maintaining, regardless of their modest circumstances. They drove in comfortable silence toward Romano's, the Italian restaurant where they'd celebrated their first anniversary. Marcus found himself studying Isabella's profile at red lights, noting the way she worried her lower lip. A tell he'd learned meant she was processing something difficult. The call came as they were reviewing the menu, Isabella's phone buzzing insistently against the checkered tablecloth. She glanced at the screen and went completely still. "Mom!" flashed across the display. Marcus watched his wife's face cycle through emotions: shock, anger, longing, and finally a careful blankness that reminded him of soldiers preparing for difficult missions. 3 years of silence, and Patricia Campbell chose their anniversary to break it. "Isabella?" Marcus kept his voice gentle, but every instinct was telling him this moment would change everything. She answered on the 6th ring. "Hello, Mother." Even from across the small table, Marcus could hear Patricia Campbell's voice, sharp with desperation, stripped of its usual icy control. The words tumbled out in a rush that spoke of genuine panic. "Isabella, thank God. I know we haven't. I know it's been." Patricia's composure cracked. "David's been arrested. Federal charges. Financial fraud involving your father's business. They came this morning with warrants." Isabella's face went pale. "David? What kind of fraud?" "The FB? I won't tell us everything, but it involves government contracts, falsified documents. Your father's company." Patricia's voice broke. "Isabella, they're saying he could face 20 years. Marcus watched his wife's hands begin to shake. David Campbell had been 15 when Isabella married him. Just a kid caught between his parents, expectations, and his sister's rebellion. In the few stories Isabella had shared, David emerged as genuinely caring but sheltered, the golden child who'd never faced real consequences. "Where is he now?" Isabella asked. "Released on bail, but barely. The amount..." Patricia's sob was audible. We had to mortgage everything. The house, the business accounts. Isabella, I know we haven't spoken, I know what we said, but you're our daughter. David is your brother, please. The word please seemed to physically pain Patricia Campbell. Marcus had never met Isabella's mother, but he'd heard enough to know that pleading was foreign to her nature. What exactly are you asking me to do? Isabella's voice carried a hardness Marcus had never heard before. Come home. Help us figure this out. David made mistakes, but he's not a criminal. Not really. He's just… Patricia struggled for words. He's just a boy who got in over his head. Isabella closed her eyes. A boy who's 22 years old. Please, Isabella. I'm begging you. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Marcus could see his wife's internal war, the hurt and anger from years of rejection battling against love for a brother who'd been caught in their parents' toxic web. I need to think about it, Isabella finally said. There isn't time to think. Patricia's desperation sharpened into her familiar commanding tone. The preliminary hearing is next week. You need, Isabella interrupted. After 3 years of having no daughter, suddenly you need me. That's not. We never said you weren't our daughter. You said if I married Marcus, I was no longer your daughter. Your exact words, Mother. So which is it? Marcus saw the moment Isabella made her decision, something shifting in her posture. Despite everything, she was going to help. Because that's who she was. Someone who chose love over self-protection, even when it cost her. I'll come, Isabella said quietly, but Marcus comes with me. The silence on the other end was telling. Even in desperation, Patricia Campbell couldn't quite stomach the idea of welcoming the man she deemed beneath her family. Isabella, perhaps it would be better if Marcus comes with me, or I don't come at all. Another pause. Marcus could practically hear Patricia's internal calculation, swallow her pride, or lose her daughter's help entirely. Of course, Patricia said finally, the words clearly painful. We'll prepare the guest room. Isabella ended the call and sat staring at her phone. Around them, Romano's continued its cheerful dinner service. Families celebrating, couples sharing quiet conversations, the normal world spinning on while theirs tilted off its axis. You don't have to do this, Marcus said quietly. Yes, I do. Isabella looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. He's my little brother, Marcus. Whatever mistakes he made, whatever our parents did to us, David didn't deserve this. Marcus reached across the table and took her hand. Then we'll help him. We? You think I'm letting you walk back into that house alone? Face those people who hurt you without backup? Marcus squeezed her fingers. We're a team, Isabella. That doesn't change because the mission got harder. The word mission slipped out before he could stop it. Military terminology he tried to avoid in civilian conversation. But Isabella was too distressed to notice. Or maybe she was just used to his occasional slips. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They're going to be horrible to you, she warned. My parents. They'll see you as confirmation of everything they believed about our marriage. A nobody who can't help in a crisis. Marcus almost smiled at the irony. If only they knew, but that knowledge would remain buried, along with all the other truths he'd learned to keep hidden. General Marcus Thompson was dead to the world, and Marcus Thompson the handyman was all he'd allowed himself to become. Let them think what they want, he said. I didn't marry you for your parents' approval. Isabella's smile was watery but genuine. I love you. I love you too. When do we leave? Tomorrow morning, I think. I'll need to call Elena. Arrange coverage at work. Isabella was already shifting into planning mode, the practical side of her nature taking over. Marcus, are you sure about this? It's going to be uncomfortable. Uncomfortable was an understatement. Walking into Patricia and Richard Campbell's world would be like stepping back into everything he'd left behind. The scrutiny, the judgments, the constant evaluation of worth based on surface appearances. They would see a man who worked odd jobs and lived in a modest apartment, never suspecting they were dismissing someone who'd once commanded respect in the highest levels of government. But Isabella needed him, and despite his complicated feelings about her family, he wouldn't let her face this alone. "I'm sure," he said. "Besides, it might be interesting to finally meet the people who raised the woman I love." Isabella laughed despite her tears. "Oh, it'll be interesting, all right. Just promise me you won't let them get to you. They have a way of making people feel small." Marcus thought of the men he'd led through impossible situations, the respect he'd earned from hardened soldiers, the decorations gathering dust in a storage unit he visited once a year. Patricia and Richard Campbell might try to make him feel small, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. "I promise," he said, meaning it in ways Isabella couldn't understand. As they left Romano's without touching their food, Marcus found himself wondering if this crisis might finally force some truth into the open. Not his truth, that would remain hidden, but perhaps the truth about what really mattered in life. Character over wealth, integrity over status, love over everything else. The Campbell family was about to learn some hard lessons about worth and judgment. They just didn't know their teacher would be the man they'd spent 3 years dismissing as nobody special. The wrought iron gates of the Campbell estate swung open with the whisper of well-oiled hinges, revealing a cobblestone driveway that curved through manicured gardens toward an imposing Georgian mansion. Isabella's hands clenched in her lap as Marcus guided their modest Honda between towering oak trees that had probably stood sentinel here since before the Revolutionary War. "Jesus," Marcus murmured, his first glimpse of the world Isabella had abandoned for him. The contrast was starker than Isabella had prepared him for. Their entire apartment could fit in the mansion's front foyer, and the casual wealth on display, imported stone, professional landscaping, a 4-car garage housing vehicles that cost more than most people's annual salary, made their modest anniversary dinner seem almost quaint. "Second thoughts?" Isabella asked, noting how Marcus's shoulders had unconsciously straightened, his posture shifting into something more alert. "About what? Marrying you?" Marcus parked behind a gleaming Mercedes that probably cost twice his annual income from veteran services. "Never." Patricia Campbell emerged from the front entrance before they'd fully stopped, her designer clothes immaculate despite the crisis consuming her family. Even in desperation, she maintained the armor of appearances. Behind her, Richard Campbell lingered in the doorway, a successful man diminished by years of deferring to his wife's stronger will. Isabella stepped out of the car and found herself momentarily transported back to adolescence, feeling small and judged under her mother's appraising gaze. 3 years had aged Patricia, fine lines around her eyes, a brittleness to her perfectly styled hair, but her ability to convey disappointment without words remained unchanged. "Isabella." Patricia's voice carried a complex mix of relief and restraint. "You look, well." "Hello, Mother." Isabella accepted a brief, perfunctory embrace that felt more like a diplomatic gesture than maternal affection. Patricia's attention shifted to Marcus, with the subtle assessment of someone accustomed to categorizing people by their usefulness. Her eyes took in his worn jeans, his practical jacket, the calloused hands of someone who worked with them. Isabella watched her mother's expression settle into polite dismissal. "Mr. Thompson." Patricia's tone could have chilled wine. "Thank you for accompanying Isabella." Marcus stepped forward, extending his hand with a quiet confidence that surprised Isabella. "Mrs. Campbell, I'm sorry about the circumstances bringing us together." The handshake was brief, Patricia's discomfort obvious. Richard approached more slowly, his businessman's instincts apparently telling him there was more to Marcus than met the eye. "Call me Richard," Isabella's father said, his grip firm and assessing. "I appreciate you coming." "Where's David?" Isabella asked, needing to focus on something other than the awkward family dynamics. "Upstairs. He's taking this hard." Patricia's maternal protectiveness flickered through her composure. The lawyers say we need to prepare for the worst. They moved through the front hall, past oil portraits of ancestors Isabella had learned to ignore, toward the formal living room where she'd spent countless uncomfortable hours as a child. Nothing had changed. The same antique furniture, the same suffocating sense of tradition and expectation. Marcus moved through the space with an alertness Isabella had noticed before in unfamiliar situations, his eyes cataloging exits and sightlines in a way that suggested old habits. She caught him pausing at a display case containing her grandfather's military medals from World War II, his expression unreadable. "Your grandfather served in the Pacific Theater," Richard offered, following Marcus's gaze. "Bronze Star, Purple Heart," Marcus observed quietly. He saw serious action. "You know military decorations?" Richard's interest sharpened. "Some. I served myself, though nothing as distinguished as this." Patricia's sniff was barely audible, but unmistakable. To her, military service without accompanying social status was just another form of manual labor. Honorable, perhaps, but hardly impressive. "Isabella's room is ready," Patricia announced, clearly wanting to move past any topic that might humanize the man she'd judged inadequate. "Though I suppose you'll want the guest room as well." The presumption that they wouldn't share a bed in her childhood home was typical Patricia, a small but pointed reminder that this was her domain, with her rules. "The guest room will be fine," Isabella said, too exhausted for battles over sleeping arrangements. They climbed the curved staircase, past family photos that chronicled Isabella's childhood, but stopped abruptly 3 years ago. The absence of wedding pictures, of any acknowledgement of her married life, was like a gap in a historical record. Isabella's childhood room remained frozen in time, her high school academic awards still displayed, her college acceptance letters framed on the wall, as if her parents could preserve the daughter they'd wanted by maintaining the shrine to who she'd been before Marcus. "I'll let you get settled," Patricia said, her tone suggesting this was a temporary arrangement. "Dinner is at 7. We'll discuss David's situation then." After her parents left, Isabella sank onto her old bed, overwhelmed by the weight of returning to a place that no longer felt like home. Marcus stood at the window, looking out over gardens he'd only glimpsed from the driveway. "You grew up here," he said finally. "I survived here." Isabella joined him at the window. "It's beautiful, I know, but beauty without warmth is just decoration." Marcus turned to study her face. "No wonder you're the strongest person I know." "I don't feel strong right now. I feel like I'm 17 again, disappointing them just by existing." "Isabella." Marcus took her hands, grounding her with his steady presence. "You're not that girl anymore. You chose love over fear, principle over convenience. That takes strength they can't understand." A soft knock interrupted them. "Isabella." David's voice, uncertain and young. She opened the door to find her brother, no longer the 15-year-old she remembered, but a man who looked haggard and frightened. Prison pallor and sleepless nights had stripped away the easy confidence she recalled. "Davy." The childhood nickname slipped out as she pulled him into a fierce hug. "I'm so sorry, Izzy, about everything. What Mom and Dad did to you, what I did by staying silent." David's voice cracked. "And now this mess. We'll figure it out," Isabella promised, feeling the protective instincts that had made her the big sister who'd bandaged his scraped knees and helped with homework. David's eyes shifted to Marcus, curiosity overcoming apprehension. "You must be Marcus." "I am." Marcus stepped forward, no judgment in his expression. "Rough situation you're in." "Yeah." David's laugh was bitter. "Rough doesn't begin to cover it. The FBI made it pretty clear they think I'm just the tip of the iceberg." "What exactly happened?" Isabella asked. David glanced toward the hallway, then closed the door. "Dad's been cutting corners on government contracts for years. I found out about 6 months ago and tried to fix things quietly, but he ran his hands through his hair. I made it worse. Much worse." Marcus's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, the casual observer becoming something more focused. "Government contracts for what kind of work?" "Import logistics. Moving equipment for military bases overseas." David's voice dropped. The documentation was creative. Inflated shipping costs, fake certifications, phantom security fees. Isabella felt the bottom drop out of her world. Not just fraud, but fraud involving military operations. The kind of crime that brought federal prosecutors and mandatory minimums. "How long has this been going on?" Marcus asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Years. Maybe longer. I only found out when I started working there full-time after graduation." David looked between them desperately. "I tried to do the right thing, but every time I fixed something I found 3 more problems. And then the FBI showed up." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing information in a way that reminded Isabella of how he approached the veteran support meetings, seeing patterns and connections others missed. "We should go down for dinner," he said finally. "Talk to your parents about what comes next." As they prepared to face the family gathering, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus was thinking several steps ahead, calculating possibilities she couldn't see. For a man who claimed to have worked a desk job, he seemed remarkably comfortable discussing federal crimes and military contracts. But those questions would have to wait. David needed help, and despite everything her parents had done, they were still her family. Even if walking back into their world felt like stepping into a beautifully appointed trap. The formal dining room felt like a war council disguised as a family dinner. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier overhead, but the elegant setting couldn't mask the tension radiating from each person seated around the mahogany table. David picked at his food with the distracted movements of someone whose appetite had abandoned him weeks ago. "Michael Foster will be here tomorrow morning," Patricia announced, cutting through the strained silence. "He's the best criminal defense attorney in Boston, Harvard Law, former prosecutor himself. Military background too," Richard added, glancing at Marcus. "Served as a JAG officer before entering private practice." Marcus looked up from his barely touched plate, something shifting in his expression. "JAG handles military justice. Interesting choice for a federal fraud case." "The charges involve military contracts," Patricia said dismissively. "We thought military experience might be relevant." "It is," Marcus agreed. "Federal procurement fraud involving defense contracts carries enhanced penalties, especially if there are questions about national security implications." The table fell silent. Isabella stared at her husband, noting the precise terminology, the casual familiarity with legal concepts that seemed far beyond his claimed desk job experience. "How do you know that?" David asked, voicing what everyone was thinking. Marcus paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. "You pick things up working with veterans. A lot of them have dealt with military justice issues." It was a reasonable explanation, but Isabella caught the careful way he deflected, the same evasive maneuver he used whenever questions got too specific about his service record. Richard leaned forward, his businessman's instincts clearly engaged. "What kind of desk job did you have exactly, Marcus?" "Logistics coordination. Nothing glamorous." Marcus's tone carried a finality that suggested the subject was closed, but Richard pressed on. "What unit? What base?" "Dad," Isabella warned, recognizing the interrogation technique her father used with potential business partners. "It's fine," Marcus said quietly. "I was stationed at several bases, mostly coordinating supply chains, equipment transfers, standard administrative work." But his knowledge seemed anything but standard. When David explained the specific charges, false documentation for armored vehicle shipments to forward operating bases, inflated security escort fees, phantom storage costs, Marcus asked questions that revealed an intimate understanding of military procurement procedures. "The base commanders who signed off on these shipments," Marcus said, studying the legal documents Richard had produced. "Did they have direct knowledge of the shipping manifests?" "That's exactly what Foster wants to establish," Richard replied, surprise evident in his voice. "How did you know that would be the key issue?" Marcus shrugged. "Logical question. If the commanders were unaware of the discrepancies, it suggests the fraud was contained to the civilian contractor side." Isabella watched her parents exchange glances. Even Patricia seemed to recognize that Marcus's insights went beyond casual veteran advocacy. He was reading the case like someone who understood not just the legal implications but the military operational context. "The preliminary hearing is Wednesday," David said quietly. Foster thinks they'll try to pressure me into revealing who else was involved. Are there others? Marcus asked. I don't know. Dad's business has dozens of government contracts. If this pattern exists elsewhere. Richard's face paled. The implications were staggering. Not just David's future, but the entire Campbell business empire built over decades. Marcus studied the documents with an intensity that made Isabella's chest tighten. There was something unsettlingly professional about his analysis, as if he were evaluating a tactical situation rather than helping with family legal troubles. We should let Foster handle the strategy, he said finally, but Isabella caught the way his eyes lingered on certain details, memorizing information with practiced efficiency. Who exactly had she married? Attorney Michael Foster arrived precisely at 9 a.m., carrying the confidence of a man accustomed to handling impossible cases. Isabella watched from the living room window as he emerged from a black BMW, his military bearing evident in the way he moved. Shoulders squared, purposeful stride, eyes automatically scanning the environment before approaching the front door. Patricia had arranged everyone in the formal sitting room like pieces on a chessboard. Richard occupied his usual leather armchair. David sat rigidly on the sofa, and Isabella found herself positioned between her family and Marcus, literally caught in the middle of two worlds that had never successfully merged. Foster's handshake with each family member was brief and professional, but when he reached Marcus, something shifted. The attorney's grip lingered a fraction longer, his eyes narrowing with the focused attention of recognition trying to surface. Marcus Thompson, Foster repeated slowly, as if testing the name against some half-remembered file. Have we met before? I don't think so, Marcus replied calmly, but Isabella caught the slight tension in his shoulders, a tell she'd learned to recognize when he was carefully managing information. Foster opened his briefcase with practiced efficiency, spreading documents across the coffee table like a general deploying maps before a crucial battle. Let me outline where we stand. The government has 18 months of financial records showing systematic overbilling on military transport contracts. David's signature appears on approximately 40% of the fraudulent documents. David's face went ashen. 40%? The good news is that pattern suggests you weren't the architect of this scheme. The bad news is that federal prosecutors don't much care whether you were a willing participant or a convenient scapegoat. Patricia's composure cracked slightly. What are our options? Cooperation, mitigation, or fighting it outright? Foster's tone carried the weight of someone who'd seen too many families destroyed by legal proceedings. David, I need you to understand that cooperation might require implicating others, possibly including your father. Richard had nothing to do with the day-to-day operations, David said quickly. He trusted me to handle the logistics. Foster's expression suggested he'd heard similar claims countless times. The FBI will want verification of that, which brings us to the central problem. Proving that someone else orchestrated this fraud requires evidence we don't currently possess. Marcus had been quietly studying the documents spread across the table, his focus intense and methodical. These base commanders who approved the shipments, he said, pointing to a specific page. Colonel Harrison at Al-Assad, Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez at Bagram. Did they file discrepancy reports? Foster looked up sharply. How do you know those names aren't in the public documents? They're referenced in the shipping manifests. Marcus replied smoothly, but Isabella noticed his careful deflection of the real question. Military personnel are required to file discrepancy reports when shipments don't match documentation, Marcus continued. If these officers filed reports about missing equipment or inflated costs, those reports would support David's claim that the fraud originated with the civilian contractors. The room fell silent. Foster stared at Marcus with growing intensity, his lawyer's instincts clearly activated by the depth of knowledge being displayed. That's exactly the avenue I was planning to pursue, Foster said slowly. How do you know about military discrepancy reporting procedures? I worked in logistics, Marcus said, but the explanation felt increasingly thin. Foster's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then excused himself to take the call in the hallway. Through the open door, Isabella could hear fragments of conversation, something about background checks and verification requests. Marcus, Patricia said during Foster's absence, her tone carrying a mixture of grudging interest and suspicion. Your insights are quite sophisticated for someone in your position. Isabella felt her protective instincts flare. His position? I simply meant that administrative work doesn't usually provide such detailed knowledge of military procurement law. Marcus's response was interrupted by Foster's return. The attorney's demeanor noticeably changed. He moved with the purposeful energy of someone who'd just received crucial intelligence. I need to step outside for a moment, Foster announced. David, I'll want to continue our discussion about the timeline of your involvement. As Foster headed toward the front door, Marcus stood abruptly. I should check on our car, he said, the excuse thin enough that Isabella almost protested. She watched through the window as the two men met on the front lawn, their conversation clearly intense, despite the physical distance. Foster gestured animatedly while Marcus stood with his hands clasped behind his back, a posture Isabella realized she'd seen countless times, but never really noticed. It was the stance of someone accustomed to receiving briefings. After 20 minutes, both men returned to the house, but the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. Foster looked at Marcus with unmistakable respect, while her husband carried himself with a new tension that spoke of carefully held secrets threatening to surface. We'll need to schedule follow-up meetings, Foster announced to the room, but his attention kept drifting to Marcus. There are some additional resources that might be available to help with David's case. What kind of resources? Richard asked. Foster glanced at Marcus, who gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. I'll need to make some calls first. Verify what options exist. As the meeting concluded and Foster prepared to leave, Isabella noticed him slip a business card to Marcus with the subtle efficiency of a practiced intelligence handoff. On the surface, it looked like a standard professional courtesy. But something in the exchange felt far more significant. That evening, after her family had retired to their respective rooms, Isabella found Marcus standing in the garden behind the house, staring up at the clear night sky, with the distant expression she'd learned meant he was wrestling with difficult memories. What did Foster say to you outside? She asked, joining him on the stone patio. Marcus was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she'd never heard before. He asked if I was ready to come out of retirement. Retirement from what? Marcus turned to face her, and in the moonlight, Isabella saw something she'd never noticed before. The bearing of a man who'd commanded others, who'd made decisions that affected lives and missions and outcomes she couldn't imagine. There are some things about my past that I've kept private, he said carefully. Not because I don't trust you, but because I wanted to leave that life behind. What life, Marcus? He reached into his pocket and pulled out Foster's business card, turning it over to reveal handwritten text. Colonel Rivera sends his regards. Time to stop hiding, General. Isabella stared at the card, the words refusing to make sense. General? Foster recognized me, Marcus said quietly. Or rather, he recognized the name when he ran a background check. My real background. The garden seemed to tilt around Isabella. Your real background? General Marcus Thompson, United States Army. Retired 3 years ago after 15 years of service, most of it in special operations and humanitarian missions overseas. The man she'd married, the quiet veteran who worked odd jobs and avoided attention, was a general. Had been a general. The implications crashed over her like waves. The knowledge he'd displayed, the way other veterans deferred to him, his instinctive understanding of military culture and protocol. You've been lying to me for 3 years, she whispered. I've been protecting you. Protecting us? Marcus's voice carried a desperation she'd never heard before. Isabella, when I retired, I wanted nothing more than to disappear. To be nobody special. To find someone who could love me for who I am, not what I accomplished or what connections I have. But you let my parents treat you like exactly what I told them I was. A man who works odd jobs and lives quietly. Marcus stepped closer, his hands reaching for hers. Everything else. My love for you, our life together, the man you married, that's all real. The rank and the recognition and the influence I could wield, that's what I wanted to leave behind." Isabella pulled away, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the deception and the implications she was only beginning to understand. "My family is in crisis. David could go to prison, and you've been hiding the fact that you have the connections and influence to help?" "Yes," Marcus said simply. "And now I have to decide whether to destroy the peace I've built to save the family that rejected you." In the distance, a phone rang inside the house, Patricia's voice answering with the sharp efficiency of someone expecting important news. But Isabella barely heard it, too stunned by the revelation that her modest, quiet husband was someone her parents would have deemed not just acceptable, but highly desirable. The irony was devastating. The man they'd scorned as a nobody was exactly the kind of person they'd always hoped she'd marry, accomplished, influential, worthy of their respect. And he'd been willing to let them despise him, rather than compromise the simple life he'd chosen. Marcus found Isabella in the garden at dawn, still wearing yesterday's clothes, her arms wrapped around her knees as she sat on the stone bench where she'd played as a child. The revelation had shattered something between them, not their love, but the fundamental understanding of who they were to each other. "You didn't sleep," he observed, settling beside her with the careful distance of someone unsure of his welcome. "Hard to sleep when you discover your entire marriage is built on a lie." Isabella's voice carried a flatness that worried him more than anger would have. "Not a lie. An omission. A 3-year omission about being a general in the United States Army." She finally looked at him, her eyes red-rimmed but sharp. "What else don't I know? Secret bank accounts? Hidden properties? A first wife you forgot to mention? Isabella, how many people died under your command, Marcus? How many lives were you responsible for before you decided to play house with the naive rich girl?" The words hit like physical blows. Marcus had faced hostile interrogations, congressional hearings, and the weight of impossible decisions in combat zones. But nothing had prepared him for seeing pain and betrayal in the eyes of the woman he loved. 53, he said quietly. "What?" 53 people died under my command over 15 years of service. I remember every name, every face, every family I had to write letters to. Marcus stared at his hands. "That's why I retired, Isabella. That's why I needed to become nobody special." The honesty seemed to crack something in her defensive armor. "Marcus, I led humanitarian missions in Afghanistan, Syria, parts of Africa where we weren't officially supposed to be. I coordinated supply lines that kept forward operating bases alive. I made decisions that saved lives, and decisions that cost lives, and at the end of 15 years I couldn't carry that weight anymore." Isabella was quiet, processing this glimpse into the darkness he'd been carrying alone. "The night we met," Marcus continued, "I was 3 months out of the army, living in a studio apartment, working at the Veterans Center because it was the only place I felt useful. You smiled at me like I was worth something, not because of my rank or my service record, but because I helped an old man with his paperwork. So you decided to keep lying. I decided to be the man you thought I was. The man I wanted to be." Marcus turned to face her fully. "Isabella, when your parents disowned you for marrying a nobody, I was relieved. Because it meant you'd chosen me for who I am. Not what I've done, or what I could do for you. But you could have done something for me. You could have spared me 3 years of pain, of wondering if I'd made the right choice, of watching you struggle with jobs beneath your abilities. Those jobs weren't beneath me. That life wasn't beneath me." Marcus's voice carried a fierce conviction. "Working with veterans who need help, fixing Mrs. Chen's broken step, having dinner with my wife at a restaurant we can barely afford. That life has more meaning than anything I accomplished wearing stars on my shoulders." Isabella stood abruptly, pacing toward the garden's edge. "My brother could go to prison, Marcus. My family is falling apart and you've been sitting on the solution for days. Have I? You think one phone call from a retired general will make David's legal problems disappear? I think your connections might open doors we can't open ourselves." Marcus felt the familiar weight of command decisions, the pressure to use influence he'd deliberately abandoned. Foster called Colonel Rivera last night. They're old friends. Rivera was my operations officer in Afghanistan. He's willing to help, to make some calls, see what can be done. Then why do you look like someone's holding a gun to your head? Because once I make that call, once I step back into that world, the man you married stops existing. I become General Thompson again, with all the baggage and expectations and responsibilities that come with it. Isabella turned back to him, and Marcus saw something shift in her expression, understanding mixing with the hurt and anger. You think I can't love both versions of you? I think the general's wife lives in a different world than the handyman's wife. I think once your parents find out who I really am, everything changes. As if summoned by his words, Patricia Campbell appeared at the garden door, her face wearing the expression of someone who just received shocking news. Isabella, Marcus, she called, her voice carrying a tremor that suggested the morning held new revelations. Michael Foster is on the phone. He says he needs to speak with General Thompson immediately. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the last walls of his carefully constructed privacy crumble. Behind Patricia's shocked face, he could see Richard hovering, and beyond him David, all of them processing the impossible reality that the man they'd dismissed as inadequate was someone of significant military distinction. It seems the choice has been made for us, Marcus said quietly. Isabella studied his face for a long moment, then nodded toward the house. Then let's go save my brother. The silence in the formal living room was deafening, as Marcus ended his call with Colonel Rivera. Patricia Campbell sat frozen in her antique chair, her carefully maintained composure shattered by the revelation that had just unfolded. Richard stood behind her, his businessman's face cycling through shock, embarrassment, and a dawning respect that came 3 years too late. David occupied the sofa's edge, staring at Marcus as if seeing him for the first time. 15 years of distinguished service, Foster had announced after hanging up with the Pentagon Verification Office. Patricia stood abruptly, her composure finally cracking completely. I was so wrong. About everything. About you. About what matters. About... She looked at Isabella with tears in her eyes. About what kind of daughter I raised, and what kind of man she was wise enough to love. The admission hung in the air like a prayer for forgiveness that might never come. Marcus watched Isabella struggle with emotions too complex for easy resolution. Vindication mixed with pain, love complicated by years of rejection. One phone call, Marcus said to Foster. But after this, I go back to being nobody special. David gets his second chance, and Isabella and I return to our quiet life. Of course, Foster agreed quickly, already reaching for his phone to coordinate with Rivera. But Marcus knew, even as he made the promise, that some doors, once opened, could never be fully closed again. The general had been revealed, and with him, the uncomfortable truth about worth, judgment, and the price of authentic love in a world obsessed with surface appearances. As Foster stepped outside to make arrangements, Marcus found himself facing a family that suddenly saw him completely differently. Not because he had changed, but because their perception of value had been shattered by an uncomfortable encounter with their own prejudices. The aftermath of Marcus's revelation settled over the Campbell household like dust after an explosion. 3 days had passed since Colonel Rivera's intervention began working its way through the Pentagon's corridors of influence, and David's case had already shifted from certain prosecution to negotiated cooperation. The federal prosecutors, suddenly aware they were dealing with a general's family, had agreed to hear David's complete testimony about the systematic fraud he discovered. But the legal victory felt hollow in the face of the deeper reckoning now consuming the family. Isabella found her mother in the sunroom at dawn, still in her robe, staring at a photo album that hadn't been opened in years. The pages showed Isabella's childhood, birthday parties in this very house, family vacations to Martha's Vineyard, graduation ceremonies where Patricia had beamed with pride at her accomplished daughter. I've been trying to remember when I became this person, Patricia said without looking up. When I started measuring worth by stock portfolios and country club memberships instead of character. Isabella settled into the wicker chair across from her mother, noting how the revelation had aged Patricia in just 3 days. The carefully maintained facade had cracked, revealing someone smaller and more fragile than the imperious woman who had ruled Boston society. "You've always been this person, Mom. I just hoped you might change." Patricia flinched but didn't argue. "Your father wants to make Marcus a partner in the business. Full equity stake, complete control over the government contracts division." Her laugh was bitter. 48 hours ago, we wouldn't let him in our front door. Now Richard sees dollar signs every time he looks at him. "And you? What do you see?" "I see a man who let me humiliate myself for 3 years rather than putting me in my place." Patricia closed the photo album with careful precision. "I see someone with more integrity in his little finger than I've managed in 52 years of life." Through the sunroom windows, Isabella could see Marcus in the garden, teaching David how to properly stake the rose bushes, a quiet moment of connection that would have been impossible before the truth emerged. Her brother had been transformed by both his legal crisis and the discovery of Marcus's real identity, his entitled arrogance replaced by genuine humility. "He's not going to take Dad's offer," Isabella said. "I know," which somehow makes it worse. Patricia looked at her daughter directly for the first time. "Isabella, I need you to know that losing you was the worst mistake of my life. Not because you married a general. Because I was too proud and shallow to trust your judgment about the man you loved." The apology Isabella had waited 3 years to hear felt strangely insufficient now. Too little, too late. Weighted down by the knowledge that her mother's remorse was triggered by Marcus's revealed status, rather than genuine recognition of the pain she'd caused. "I want to forgive you," Isabella said carefully, "but I need to understand that you're not just sorry because you discovered Marcus was important. I need to know you'd feel this way, even if he really had been a handyman with no connections." Patricia was quiet for a long moment, processing the impossible question. Would she feel the same regret if Marcus had remained nobody special? The honest answer was uncomfortable. "I don't know," Patricia admitted finally. "I wish I could say yes, but I don't know if I'm that good a person." The brutal honesty was somehow more comforting than false reassurances would have been. At least now they could work with the truth. In the library, Richard Campbell was having his own reckoning with Marcus. The two men seated across from each other in leather chairs that had witnessed decades of business discussions. But this conversation had nothing to do with commerce. "I've spent 30 years building a company, making connections, establishing reputation," Richard said, his voice heavy with shame. "And I never understood that the most important connection is the one you have with your own family." Marcus studied the older man, seeing genuine remorse beneath the businessman's practiced exterior. "Isabella loves you, despite everything. That's not something to waste." "How do you do it? How do you let go of the past and move forward?" "You don't let go," Marcus replied. "You carry it with you and try to do better. Every day you try to be the man you wish you'd been yesterday." Richard leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "The offer I made about the partnership, I know you won't take it. But I need you to understand, it comes from genuine respect, not just gratitude for helping David. I appreciate that. But I meant what I said about returning to our quiet life." Even knowing what it cost, Isabella, the pain you could have prevented? Marcus felt the weight of that question, like a physical blow. It was the same accusation Isabella had made, the same doubt that had kept him awake for 3 nights running. "I made a choice to protect our privacy over her family relationships," he said slowly. "I'm not sure it was the right choice anymore." In David's room, a different kind of conversation was taking place. Isabella sat on her brother's bed while he packed for his return to his apartment in the city, his cooperation agreement requiring regular meetings with federal investigators. "I keep thinking about the last 3 years," David said, folding clothes with the careful precision of someone who'd learned not to take simple freedoms for granted. "All the family dinners where your empty chair reminded everyone of what we'd lost. Dad would get this look, like he wanted to say something, but Mom would change the subject." "Dad wanted to reach out?" "I think so. But you know how he is. He follows Mom's lead on family stuff." David paused in his packing. "Izzy, I should have called you. Should have tried to bridge the gap somehow. You were a kid caught in the middle of an impossible situation. I was old enough to know right from wrong." David's voice carried a maturity that hadn't existed a week ago. Old enough to recognize that Marcus made you happy in a way I'd never seen before. Isabella felt tears threatening. What happens now, Davy? Do we pretend the last 3 years didn't happen? Do we go back to being a family like nothing changed? I don't think we can go back. But maybe we can go forward differently. David sat beside her on the bed. Mom's been talking about selling the house, downsizing. She says she wants to find work that actually matters, instead of just attending charity galas. Mom? Working? Marcus suggested she look into veteran family support services. Apparently, there's a real need for people who understand how to navigate complex systems and advocate for families dealing with bureaucracy. The idea of Patricia Campbell, social climber extraordinaire, working with military families seemed impossible. But then again, a week ago, the idea of their family having this conversation had seemed equally unlikely. That evening, as the family gathered for what might be their last dinner together for a while, the dynamics had fundamentally shifted. Patricia spoke less and listened more. Richard deferred to Isabella's opinions rather than dismissing them. David engaged with genuine interest in Marcus's work with veterans rather than polite indifference. But the changes felt fragile, like a newly healed bone that might break again under pressure. "When will you go back to your apartment?" Patricia asked as they finished dessert. "Tomorrow morning," Isabella replied. "We both need to get back to work." "And we'll see you again soon?" The question hung in the air, weighted with 3 years of separation and the uncertain promise of reconciliation. Isabella looked at Marcus, seeing in his expression the same careful hope she felt. "We'll see," she said finally. "But Mom, next time we talk, it needs to be because you want Isabella in your life, not because you need General Thompson's connections." Patricia nodded, accepting the condition even as it stung. "I understand." As they prepared to leave the next morning, Marcus stood in the foyer where Isabella had been disowned 3 years earlier. The marble floors were the same, the oil paintings unchanged, but everything else felt different. "No regrets?" Isabella asked, watching him take in the opulent surroundings he was choosing to leave behind. "Only one," Marcus replied. "I regret the pain you carried because of my choices. And I regret that it took a crisis to force the truth into the open." They walked out of the Campbell mansion together, leaving behind a family changed by revelations and reckonings, but uncertain whether those changes would prove lasting or merely temporary responses to crisis. The real test would come in the quiet moments ahead, whether love could truly triumph over years of hurt, whether forgiveness could be built on a foundation of hard truths rather than comfortable lies. 6 months later, Isabella stood in the kitchen of their modest apartment, preparing dinner, while Marcus worked at the small table that served as his makeshift office. The familiar rhythm of their evening routine felt both comforting and strange. The same activities in the same space, but everything fundamentally altered by the events that had forced them back into her family's orbit. Marcus's laptop displayed emails from Colonel Rivera, updates on David's cooperation with the federal investigation, and correspondence from veterans, organizations that had somehow learned of his involvement in resolving the procurement fraud case. Despite his best efforts to return to anonymity, word had spread through military networks that General Thompson was quietly available for consultation on complex cases involving veteran welfare. "Elena's coming for dinner Friday," Isabella announced, stirring the pasta sauce she'd learned to make from Mrs. Chen downstairs. "She wants to hear the full story about your dramatic revelation. I'm sure she does." Marcus's tone carried mild amusement. Elena Martinez had been skeptical of his mysterious background from the beginning, and vindication had made her insufferable in the most loving way possible. Isabella's phone buzzed with a text from David. Interview with prosecutors went well. They're recommending reduced charges, community service, and restitution rather than prison time. Marcus's friend came through. She showed Marcus the message, watching relief cross his features. Colonel Rivera's intervention had been decisive, his reputation for integrity lending credibility to David's claims about discovering rather than orchestrating the fraud. The real architects, several mid-level executives in Richard's company, were now facing the serious charges David had escaped. "He's been calling twice a week," Isabella said, settling into the chair across from Marcus. David, I mean. Sometimes just to talk, sometimes asking for advice about the investigation. How do you feel about that? Isabella considered the question. Good, mostly. He's different now, more thoughtful, less entitled. It's like the crisis forced him to grow up. She paused. He asked if he could visit next weekend. Says he wants to see how we really live. Marcus closed his laptop, giving her his full attention. And? I said yes. But I'm nervous about it. What if he judges our life the way Mom and Dad did? What if he can't understand why we choose this over what his world offers? Then he's not as changed as you think he is. The honesty was typical Marcus. No false reassurance. Just clear-eyed assessment. It was one of the qualities that had drawn her to him initially, and that she'd learned to value even more during the difficult months of rebuilding trust between them. Their relationship had survived the revelation of his hidden identity, but not without scars. Isabella had struggled with feeling deceived, while Marcus grappled with guilt over the pain his secrecy had caused. They'd worked through it with the same methodical patience Marcus brought to everything else, talking late into the night about trust and protection, and the difference between privacy and deception. Mom started her volunteer work at the Veterans Family Center, Isabella said, sharing the week's family news. Apparently, she's quite good at navigating bureaucracy on behalf of families who don't know how to fight the system. Natural talent for intimidating government workers? Isabella laughed. Something like that. She says it's the first work she's done that feels meaningful. She hesitated, then added, she wants to have dinner with us next month. Just the four of us. Her, Dad, you, and me. Marcus was quiet for a moment. How do you feel about that? Terrified. Hopeful. Angry that it took a crisis for them to see what was always there. Isabella traced patterns on the table with her finger, but also grateful that they're trying to change. The changes in her parents had been gradual but genuine. Patricia had stepped back from most of her social obligations, throwing herself into advocacy work with the intensity she'd once reserved for charity galas. Richard had restructured his business to eliminate the problematic government contracts entirely, taking a significant financial hit to ensure complete compliance with federal regulations. But the most significant change had been their approach to family relationships. The weekly phone calls from her mother no longer felt like obligations or attempts to exert control. Instead, Patricia asked about Isabella's work, her happiness, her life with Marcus, genuine interest replacing the shallow inquiries that had characterized their relationship before. David told me something interesting last week, Isabella continued. He said Dad has been asking him about your work with veterans, trying to understand what motivates you to help people who can't offer anything in return. And what did David tell him? That some people serve others because it's who they are, not because of what they get from it. Isabella smiled. He said Dad looked like he was solving a math problem he'd never encountered before. Marcus chuckled. Richard's not a bad man. He just lived in a world where every relationship was transactional for so long that genuine service is foreign to him. You're generous in your assessment. I'm practical. If we're going to rebuild relationships with your family, I need to work with who they are, not who I wish they were. The doorbell interrupted their conversation. Mrs. Chen stood in the hallway, holding a plate of homemade dumplings and wearing the concerned expression that meant she'd been worrying about them. You both look too thin, she announced, bustling into their apartment with the familiarity of someone who'd become surrogate family. Also, there was a man here earlier asking questions about Marcus. Isabella and Marcus exchanged glances. What kind of questions? Military questions. He showed identification, said he was from some veterans. Organization. I told him Marcus wasn't home and asked for his card. Mrs. Chen produced a business card for the Veterans, Coalition for Government Accountability, an organization Isabella had never heard of, but that made Marcus's expression tighten with recognition. They want me to testify before Congress, Marcus explained after Mrs. Chen left, about systematic procurement fraud in military contracts. Apparently, David's case was just the tip of the iceberg. And you're going to do it? I don't want to. But Rivera thinks my testimony could prevent other families from going through what David experienced. Marcus rubbed his temples. It would mean going public, accepting recognition, becoming General Thompson again in a very visible way. Isabella felt the familiar tension between her husband's desire for privacy and his sense of duty. "What do you want to do?" "I want to stay here, work with veterans who need help, have dinner with my wife, and pretend the rest of the world doesn't exist." Marcus looked at her directly. "But I also can't ignore the possibility that speaking up might prevent other young men from facing the choices David faced." "Then speak up." "Isabella, Marcus, I fell in love with a man who helps people who need help. Whether he's a handyman or a general doesn't change that fundamental truth about who you are." Isabella reached across the table to take his hand. "You can't serve others by hiding from service." That night, as they lay in bed in their small apartment above the flower shop, Isabella listened to the familiar sounds of the neighborhood settling into sleep. Car doors closing, voices calling goodnight, the distant hum of traffic on the main road. Simple sounds of ordinary life that had become precious to her. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked in the darkness. "Giving up the life you could have had?" Quote, "Every day," Marcus replied, then added before she could respond, "I regret that it took me so long to find this life. To find you." Isabella smiled against his shoulder. "Even if my family comes with more drama than you bargained for? Especially because of that. Anyone can love someone with a perfect family. It takes real commitment to love someone whose mother can clear a room with pure disapproval. She's getting better. She is, and so are we." Isabella knew he was right. They were building something new, not just the restoration of her family relationships, but a stronger foundation for their marriage based on complete honesty rather than careful omissions. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be more challenges ahead. But for the first time since that desperate phone call 6 months ago, Isabella felt genuinely hopeful about the future. Her family was learning to value character over status, Marcus was finding ways to serve without sacrificing their privacy entirely, and she was discovering that love really could triumph over years of hurt and misunderstanding. The bridge back to her family hadn't been rebuilt overnight, but it was growing stronger with each honest conversation, each genuine gesture of change, each moment of choosing love over pride. And that, Isabella thought, as sleep claimed her, was worth all the pain they'd endured to get here. 1 year later, Isabella stood in the same garden where Marcus had revealed his true identity, watching her family prepare for a celebration that would have been unimaginable 18 months earlier. Today marked their 4th wedding anniversary, but more significantly, it represented the first time the entire Campbell family had gathered to honor Isabella and Marcus's marriage. Patricia emerged from the house carrying a bouquet of white roses, her designer dress replaced by practical clothes suitable for setting up folding chairs on the lawn. The transformation was remarkable. The woman who had once measured worth by social standing now found purpose in meaningful work, having established a nonprofit organization helping military families navigate complex benefit systems. "The minister should be here soon," Patricia announced, her voice carrying none of the commanding tone Isabella remembered from childhood. "Are you nervous about renewing your vows in front of everyone?" Isabella watched Marcus across the garden, deep in conversation with David about the younger man's new position at a veterans advocacy organization. Her brother had found his calling in the aftermath of his legal troubles, using his business education to help streamline services for families in crisis. "Not nervous. Grateful," Isabella replied honestly. Richard approached carrying additional chairs, his movements more energetic than Isabella had seen in years. The stress of restructuring his business had initially aged him, but finding purpose beyond profit had restored something vital. He now served on the board of 3 veterans charities and had become an unexpected advocate for ethical business practices. "Marcus is giving Elena the full briefing on procurement oversight procedures," Richard said with amusement. "I think he's found his match in someone who asks as many detailed questions as he does." Elena Martinez stood near the garden's edge, notebook in hand, conducting what appeared to be an informal interview with Colonel Rivera, who had flown in from Washington for the ceremony. As Isabella's maid of honor, Elena had insisted on understanding every detail of the events that had transformed both Isabella's family and Marcus's relationship with his military past. 5 minutes until the ceremony, Patricia called out, her organizational skills now channeled toward family events rather than social maneuvering. Marcus approached Isabella, wearing the same simple suit he'd worn to their original wedding ceremony 4 years earlier. But everything else had changed. His willingness to be known rather than hidden, her family's recognition of true worth, their shared understanding that love required both honesty and forgiveness. "Ready to marry me again?" he asked, offering his arm with a smile that held none of the careful reserve she remembered from their early relationship. "Every day for the rest of our lives," Isabella replied, meaning it completely. As they walked toward the minister waiting beside Patricia's prized rose bushes, Isabella reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The crisis that had nearly destroyed her family had instead forced everyone to confront fundamental questions about values, worth, and what truly mattered in life. Marcus had found balance between service and privacy, testifying before Congress about procurement fraud while maintaining his quiet work with individual veterans. Her parents had discovered that meaning came from helping others, rather than impressing peers. David had grown from entitled young man into someone who understood the weight of responsibility and the value of second chances. Dearly beloved, the minister began, and Isabella felt the rightness of the moment, not just the renewal of vows between her and Marcus, but the renewal of family bonds that had been broken by pride and healed by truth. The ceremony was simple, attended by people who had learned to measure worth by character rather than status. As Isabella and Marcus exchanged the same vows they'd spoken 4 years earlier, she understood that they weren't just renewing their commitment to each other. They were affirming that authentic love, built on complete honesty and genuine respect, could triumph over any obstacle. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife again, the applause came from a family transformed, gathered in a garden where truth had finally taken root and grown into something beautiful. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,